All right, hi everyone. Welcome to Pharmacology. My name is Chad Peterson. Hello everyone, and I'm happy to be here as your pharm instructor for the next 3 semesters. A little bit of my background. I am a practicing pharmacist in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. I live in Plymouth. I have a wife, Janae, and 3 kids. My wife works from home, and so this is her default work background. If you can see the picture she's got set up here. So it's my son, Elliot, daughter, Lola, and our newest addition, Charlie. So Elliot's almost 7. He'll be starting first grade. Lola is 4.5. She'll be going into pre-K, and Charlie is just the little one, and he is 6 months, 5 months right now. Yeah, that's me. I have a full-time job as a pharmacist at Abbott Northwestern Hospital in Minneapolis, and I've had a variety of practice roles there, primarily clinical background in emergency medicine and behavioral health, but I've staffed kind of more general areas too. So as a pharmacist, I think there are pharmacists that practice in specialty areas, but a lot of us have more of a generalist mentality. You kind of have to know everything about every drug. So I do have a pretty good background, I think, as far as breadth of scope, or the scope of topics we'll be covering. I'll give you the caveat, though, that I'm not an expert at every single thing I'll talk about, but I think I've compiled a good collection of topics and things that are interesting to you. I really want you guys to have access to learn about as many drugs as possible that's feasible, without maybe going into too far in the weeds on certain specialty topics. So that's the way the curriculum's set up. My other piece of my background is that I have been teaching at Bethel University in St. Paul in their PA program for 7 years, and that's actually how I got hooked up with this gig this year, and my work with Christy in the initial phases of the Bethel program. She reached out to me to see if I'd be interested in kind of mirroring what I was doing at Bethel for the Northwestern program. So that's why I'm here. You're going to be getting the exact same content Bethel students are getting. And in fact, I will be upfront with you guys. I recycle my content and reuse my PowerPoints and lectures year to year. I do a fair amount of updating to different topics here and there and re-record as needed. But just note that you're getting pre-recorded lectures from me that I've put together over the years and have updated on a regular basis, depending on new guidelines and things like that. Some topics don't really require a lot of updating. I was just doing a CE this morning, and it was about Parkinson's disease, and I realized that literally nothing has changed, which is kind of sad for Parkinson's patients. But at the same time, some topics just really don't change that much, or there's not a lot of dynamic updates in them. Other things like hypertension and cholesterol and cardiology guidelines seem to be quite a bit different every time they publish something. It's like they feel like they have to change it because there's so much evidence in that area, new trials and things like that come out. Other areas of medicine really don't have a lot of new stuff going on, or at least there's not a whole lot of breakthrough that happens quite often. So that's the way the course is laid out. But again, with Bethel, I've been doing it since the beginning with them, and it started as an in-person thing, but my course evolved into a hybrid online program, and then that was pre-COVID. With COVID, we moved it all online. I think overall students respond really well to the online format. I think people like to, one, watch me in faster speed, so you can speed me up while you're watching, which I don't know how I feel about that, but I'll take it for what it's worth. And then also just to have the luxury to watch when you want, as opposed to like having to wait until I'm done with work, which usually would be like a late afternoon module. And then I would come in and they were in class all day, and then they have to listen to 2 hours of me, which wasn't the most conducive to learning for certain students based on some feedback. So anyway, I think people really have responded well to the content of my class, and I think the online portion has gone over actually quite well. It's a really straightforward class setup. It's just lectures. There's 4 exams each semester, with the exception of the summer where I do 2 exams. So it's a little bit shorter. And then there's these weekly quizzes. The quizzes are designed to keep you accountable to your module so that you don't feel like you're getting behind. So those do have deadlines to them. And then you also have, again, the lectures that are each week. If you wonder about the weekly schedule, I'm still getting everything set up on Blackboard because I'm getting used to the different system. Bethel uses a different program. But I've got your basic stuff on there, your syllabus on there, and the syllabus has your weekly schedule on there. So I'll update that and add more modules as I get time. But for now, you might see it kind of pieced week to week together. But I usually try to get everything done like on the Saturday before the week. So in case you want to watch it on Sunday, or spend some extra time in pharmacology over the weekend, And if that works better for you, you have that option. So that's my goal. I don't always make it. I will always get your stuff up on Monday, though, at the latest, by Monday morning or Monday by noon at some point there. Your test schedules are out, so you have access to that. If you want to go over anything specific with me, email is the easiest way to get a hold of me. If you feel like you're really struggling and not getting it and you want to talk to me face to face, we can set up a Zoom meeting. We can set up just a regular old phone call. Any type of discussion would be fine with me if you really want to go there. If you guys feel like you need more support as a class, we can look at doing other types of recordings or other types of modules as well, as far as review type things or other live reviews too. So I'm really open to however we want to make this work. But again, I've been doing this distance for Bethel, and it's going to be basically the exact same as what they're getting, even though they're 20 minutes from my house. It's going to be basically the exact same course. So hopefully that works. If you guys have any questions about this, again, please discuss, email with me. I'm more than happy to answer questions. I'm going to get into some content here and talk about syllabus and things like that. But what I will talk about is just the nature of the course. And the nature of this course is that we're going to be talking about a lot of drugs in a fairly short amount of time. You guys have a lot of medicine to cover and medical practice to cover in a relatively condensed period of time. So I want to make the most of it. I want to give you access to the content you'll need, understanding you won't be an expert in any one area by the end of this course, but at least you'll have some cohesive pharmacology behind you when you go out into practice. With that said, this course can be overwhelming for some people at first, especially if you've never had a pharmacology background or have never taken a pre-pharm course or haven't worked with drugs in any capacity. That's okay. It's a lot of people are in your position. I would just say stay on top of it. Pharmacy is kind of like learning a new language. It does require some rote memorization. And, there's a lot of people who ask me for strategies and things like that. And I think the first step really is make sure you understand the drugs. Do you know, if I name a drug, do you know what that is? So, sounds basic, but a lot of people do struggle with that concept of getting those drugs into their head. And then you can apply the mechanisms and therapeutic decision-making type things to that once you understand it. But you have to know the drugs, and you have to be able to do some memorization. And that's really the nature of learning any type of new process like this. And healthcare is kind of all over with that, but certainly pharmacy is no different. And I think you'll get a lot out of it. I think it'll come back and help you a lot in your practice, but you will have to put the work in up front. With that said, people tend to do pretty well in my class. I will tell you what you need to know. And with that, we're going to move on into the actual lecture. I'm going to go back to the slides, but hopefully you enjoyed seeing me. At least there's a face now to the slides, and we'll talk to you guys later. Okay, so this is the introduction. I realize my slides said Bethel on them, but again, this is my family. I think I mentioned that. Oops, you're going to see probably a lot of random stuff like this. I apologize for that, but Blackboard site. So your Blackboard site is the nexus of information. We're going to have all the lectures and recordings posted up there, including the syllabus is on there, and the first 2 lectures are there. The flexibility of the course isn't really a big deal anymore. It's mostly on you at this point to complete the course in the time you see fit. Weekly modules are assigned, and it's expected that you complete each module on a weekly basis. However, real life comes up, and I get that some people might delay something. I highly encourage you to stay on top of the content. It will catch up with you if you don't. So make sure you are keeping up on that schedule, however that works for you. Guest speakers, I have used some guest speakers in the past. I probably won't this time around. I might have a friend of mine who works as an HIV pharmacist, and he's got some interesting specialty experience. That wouldn't really be tested material, but if I do have access to a specialist like, and these aren't guest speakers, but I do have kids, so you might get an occasional random additional voice here or there, or sometimes you might notice that there's maybe not the best transition between some sentences I have. That might be because I got interrupted, paused, and resumed later. So I apologize for those breaks, but that's just the way life goes. So hopefully you understand and can forgive me for that. Tests are all multiple choice. There's like one short answer I do, and a couple math problems I do related to opioid dose conversions. I'll let you know all that stuff as we get to it. vast majority are short answer, sorry, not short answer, multiple choice, and are short cases is what I meant to say. So I usually do case-based questions. So there might be a case that has multiple parts to it. I do some basic questions too, basic mechanism of action, basic side effects, and just kind of general drug questions. But I try to keep my therapeutic questions in case-based format. The cases are usually part of the quizzes right now, is how I've done it recently, and that's how I've done it with Bethel. And I actually think that's been working well. So there'll be a weekly quiz, and the quiz will have an open-ended question. I encourage you to answer it, think about it, do the research on it like it was a test question, and think about the different possibilities. And then I'll have an answer that's my logic behind my what I think what the correct response is. And they're usually pretty open-ended. They aren't necessarily exactly like you would see on an exam, but they're pretty similar as far as their content, except in an exam I would focus them more so it would lead you to a specific answer versus the quiz cases are much more open-ended and you can kind of go down a number of different directions. The textbook. So I won't ever ask you a question from the textbook that's not in my lecture slides. You can do well in pharmacology without owning the book. You can probably ace the class. I teach off my slides and that's it. I did use the book when I originally kind of put some of the stuff together. The book is, I won't say not to buy the book because the book does go into depth into the pharmacologic mechanisms of things that simply we don't have time to. We need to talk about therapies and therapeutic decision making to get you guys ready for practice. And I don't have time to go into every single mechanism type thing. However, if you want that background, the book does do a good job of some more in-depth pharmacology per se. So if you want to go that route, I would encourage you to look into it. But if you bought it and you haven't opened it or whatever, and you're like, I could save myself $100 or however much it costs, then feel free to. You don't need the book for this course. Again, questions, emailing me is the best way to get a hold of me. Again, if you really are struggling with something and want to set up a communication, more intimate communication, I should say, if you want to talk video chat or face-to-face, if you're in the cities or something, want to meet me, we could probably figure that out. But otherwise, we'll stick to email, and then we can go from there. So we're going to be talking about drugs, of course, and we're going to be synthesizing pharmacology with pathophys into kind of this made-up topic called pharmacotherapy, which is something that we learn in pharmacy school. It's a course sequence, and it's kind of like our capstone sequence. I would equate it to how you guys approach clinical medicine, where everything kind of comes together. That's pharmacotherapy for pharmacists, and so that's what I'm going to try to teach you. It's the most relevant as far as, if you're in real life, how do you prescribe medications, and what do you pick in what situations? So we're going to build on to the basics of what is pharmacology, because pharmacology itself is more scientific approach, and we'll talk about that here in a second. Basic drug names, classes, mechanisms of action, those are all going to be kind of your core foundational things that we're going to talk about. Is the medication indicated, safe, and effective? Adverse drug reactions. So what are the safety profiles of each medication we discuss? What are the big ones to remember? Obviously, you've probably seen commercials where they talk about medication adverse reactions like it's, a copy at the bottom of the page and it just kind of goes on forever, kind of like a scrolling text on a Star Wars movie. But you don't have that luxury to know all of that. You can look it up, but you should know some basic things. And so we'll try and kind of drill those hallmark side effects into you guys. Drug interactions are big deals. We'll talk about those as we get to them and which ones to really, what they are, and clinically, how do we assess whether they're relevant or not. Lots of clinical pearls. I think that just comes with practice from my personal perspective, just things that I've picked up, things I've picked up from colleagues or providers or professors or people I've worked with over the years and that I want to pass on to you. And then the disease state synthesis, which is kind of the big deal. Like, how do you bring it all together and how do you actually, okay, so we talked about these drugs in the context of this disease. How do I actually use them? That's the big question. That's what I want to get you guys to think about. What is pharmacy? I think this YouTube clip got taken down. It was the Jerry Seinfeld joke about pharmacists. You can probably find it. I was trying to find a new one, but I couldn't, so I just left it here. Just a dead link. Sorry about that. But I think people think of pharmacists as being these people who kind of hang out behind the counter in retail situations and just count pills and get paid a lot of money to do nothing. In reality, there's not, it's not necessarily false, but there's a lot more to what pharmacists do, and we have a big role to play basically in any aspect of medicine, from insurance companies to hospital care to retail. One of the cool things I think about pharmacists is we're arguably one of the most accessible healthcare providers with the level of education that we have. So most pharmacists that have graduated since the mid 90s have a doctorate of pharmacy. So we have a 4-year additional degree on top of whatever undergrad we did. And in the case of the majority of pharmacists in practice right now, anybody can go to a retail pharmacist and ask them a question. You don't have to have an appointment. You don't have to. You can kind of interrupt whatever they're doing and ask them something, and they might ask you to wait or something like that. But the point is that you have pharmacists are very accessible healthcare providers, and there's really not another healthcare provider that I can think of that you can just kind of walk in and just talk to like that. You usually have to go through some sort of receptionist or appointment system or something like that. It's not that PAs or MDs or nurses are difficult to get a hold of, and certainly there's ways to talk to those people as well. But I think pharmacists are in a very unique role where we do have a lot of interface with the general public, which can be good or bad. I personally don't have a lot of interfacing with the general public because I work in the hospital setting, so mine's more restricted to the hospital-specific patients. But I certainly do end up with a bunch of patient direct roles as well, where I talk to patients about medication education, or getting medication histories, figuring out what they've been taking at home, or simply just assisting with their care on an as-needed basis. I say we're nice and like to help. That's most of us, right? There's exceptions to all the rules, but for the most part, I highly recommend you, in your whatever practice you're in, you make a relationship with a pharmacist. Whether it's the Walgreens down the street you send most of your prescriptions to, whether it's the hospital pharmacist that works at the desk right behind you, whatever situation you're in, use pharmacists to your advantage. We have a lot of skills to offer. We have a lot of education, and we spent a lot of time reading about drugs, and we don't know all the stuff you guys do, but we can help augment your knowledge of drugs by offering our advice and being kind of a sounding board for your ideas. I have a lot of providers I've worked with over the years that simply like to come and kind of think out loud in front of me, and then kind of get the green light or the rubber stamp of pharmacist approval, and that's fine too. Like, I don't mind that. I've had other people that throw really complicated questions at my feet, being like, I don't know what to do. What do you think I should do? I'll basically do whatever you say. And that is a great relationship to have, where somebody trusts me enough to respect my opinion on those types of things too. So use your pharmacist and make relationships with your pharmacist. Jess Tonder put some slides together, and I think I got sent the slides and they still have her name on them, but I think somebody else presented them to you, which again, I think the crossover with Bethel and Northwestern here is interesting. But the point is that you guys got an Intro to Pharm lecture that talked more about writing prescriptions and things like that. I'm not really going to go through it again, but it's got some information in it that's good as well. So what we're going to be talking about, I talked about pharmacotherapy. What I learned as a pharmacist is a couple things. So we build on two concepts of medicinal chemistry and pharmacology. Medicinal chemistry is structure-activity relationships, basically looking at the chemical structure of a compound and deciding how that interacts with the body. That's it. You don't really go any further than that with medicinal chemistry. So if you're a med chem PhD person, all you're trying to do is make novel compounds that do things. That's it. You kind of want the context, right? But that's really the goal. And then a pharmacologist might take that and say, oh, okay, well, we can look at this compound and say, well, we know this compound interacts with these specific groups of receptors. And when that interacts with the receptors, the pharmacologist would say, well, that produces this effect in the body. So what's that response of the medicinal agent? Now, pharmacotherapy takes that one step further and says, okay, we know that that has a certain response. So let's take beta blockers, for example, for various heart conditions. They slow down the heart rate in their basic form. They antagonize the beta receptor or block the beta receptor on the heart. And so what happens is you have more than one, right? Your beta receptors, excuse me. So some med chemist figures out that, well, I can make an analog of norepinephrine or epinephrine or adrenaline. And that structure, if I tweak it a little bit, instead of working on the receptor and agonizing it, it actually blocks it and prevents it from doing anything. Great. The pharmacologist says, well, if we do that, that actually lowers heart rate and can lower blood pressure too. Okay. And then the pharmacotherapist, which isn't a real thing, but then the therapeutic side of it is, okay, if we lower blood pressure or heart rate, how does that positively impact certain disease states? So that's the whole moving from this more sciencey, researchy approach to actually getting our applications and discussing how we really use these drugs in real life. So that's why this is bolded, and that's really where we come through, talk about the majority of our content in this course. I'm going to spend some time talking about drug backgrounds and where things come from. So this slide it's kind of an old slide, but it's basically the same thing today. But a lot of drugs actually have a biologic background. And so somebody might have isolated a compound from nature. Maybe it was a venom from a snake or a plant or something like that. In fact, pharmaceutical companies invest quite a bit of money into researching these types of areas, because if you don't have to reinvent the wheel, why do it? I mean, if you know that if somebody gets bit by a poisonous snake, if they get some sort of specific reaction, you can be like, let's say it makes somebody much more likely to bleed out. Well, it's got an anticoagulant effect. Interesting. So what compound in there is acting as an anticoagulant, and can we use that as a therapeutic? The answer might be no, but it's worth investigating, and it might give you a head start as opposed to doing a bunch of research from scratch and trying to design your own molecules. That certainly does happen as well, but drugs do come from all sources. So I always think it's kind of funny when people are like, well, I always prefer a natural approach to things. Like, well, a lot of drugs actually are natural or have a very natural background as to how they were designed. This is just an example. It's one of my favorites because it's kind of an interesting creature. The Mexican beaded lizard, or the Gila monster, is found in the southwest U.S. It's actually one of the only poisonous species of lizards in the world. Maybe there's more than them. I don't know. I think it's one of a few anyway. But the venom of it was actually used in a product called Byetta or exenatide, which is a hypoglycemic agent. And while we don't use Byetta very much anymore because it was one of the first ones out on the market, a lot of analogs of Byetta have come out since, and it's one of the a primary agent we use for type 2 diabetes. So there's, again, lots of interesting applications that people pull from real life nature sources versus just simply dreaming up in a laboratory. Big Pharma, it's important to understand, I think, a little bit about how drugs get to market, how they're developed, and how we study medications. And we always joke in the industry of pharmacy, or in the profession of pharmacy, that when people go to the industry side or go to work for a drug company, they're going to the dark side. The pay is better, the hours are better, but you're basically just working for one single company that's got massive profit margins. So there's your flip side of the coin. So anyway, I don't have anything against it. In fact, I think there's some great work that can be done in the pharmaceutical industry, don't get me wrong, but it's always something we kind of joke about. This just is a slide on here that probably doesn't mean much to you, but it does show the current revenues of the big ticket items in the world of pharmacy and what we're spending our money on in healthcare. A lot of these drugs are chemotherapies. Most of them are. Humira is an anti-inflammatory medication used for a variety of different autoimmune disorders. And so the interesting thing about these medications is almost all of them are used for very niche indications. They just don't have a lot of people. The exceptions would be Eliquis and, or is it Xarelto? Eliquis and Xarelto are newer anticoagulants, and those apply to the AFib market. So that's actually pretty much volume of prescription, and they're new and brand name and expensive too. But the other thing to think about is a lot of these drugs are biologic agents. I'm going to talk about that in a second, but there's basically two different categories of medications out there. There are small molecule traditional drugs. Those are like tablets that you take. If you look at the structure of the medication, it's very small. It's not like a big chain of peptides or things like that. The other category is biologic. Biologic agents are often peptide chains. They might be enzyme analogs or something like that, designed to interact with a specific area in the body. They're very targeted in their approach. And there's a lot of developments in those areas. Small molecule drugs, still we get new stuff out all the time, but biologic have been kind of an explosive market in the last 10 years, and it's something that we're seeing more and more products come out. So when it comes to anything that's anti-inflammatory, like for rheumatoid arthritis, Crohn's disease, those medications always hit kind of the top tiers of these how much money we're spending on drugs type of thing. And Humira is no exception to that. Obviously, it's the number one, which is that's actually pretty impressive to me. But these medications are really expensive too. So not only do you have, this one's kind of the combo of the best of both worlds. You have a lot of people who apply for whose diseases apply to take this, and it's also a very expensive medication. So like, an oral medication, let's look at Eliquis. Eliquis is probably $10 a dose. So you're looking at maybe a few $100 for a monthly dispense, and that's assuming you're paying cash and not getting any insurance copayment or anything like that. Humira is going to cost you probably a couple $1,000s a month out of pocket. So you're looking at, in the tens of thousands of dollars a year for a course of Humira. Very, very different numbers we're talking about here when it comes to biologic agents. Now, biologic agents are simply or very niche drugs like Biktarvy. Biktarvy is an anti-HIV med, and it is a not a biologic agent, it's a tablet, but it's so specific in the patients it targets that these companies, because they invest so much research dollars into it, they charge a lot of money for these specific agents. So even though it might not cost that much to make it, the research behind it and the limited market means that company wants to recoup their losses, or their investment, I should say, and so they charge a lot of money for it. So not all these things are injectable biologic agents, because those do actually cost more. They're more intensive to produce as far as manufacturing costs and things like that. And a lot of manufacturers don't even touch them because they're so expensive to make. But you have a lot of other medications that just really only apply to very small patient margins. And the cool thing is that we have companies that actually do research to get drugs out for those patients. I just did a CE on MS drugs, and multiple sclerosis is a very small amount of patients worldwide, relatively speaking, compared to like hypertension or AFib. But you do have new therapies coming out in that area because drug companies can do this. They can charge a lot of money, and hopefully insurance companies will pay for most of it, and somehow they kind of wind up working itself out. But it's a delicate dance, and there's certainly a lot of price gouging and things like that goes on. But the point is that it's always kind of interesting for me to look at this stuff, because you never really know like what medications are on top, and it's always kind of surprising to see what we're spending the most money on. Now, contrast that. This is a little bit older of data. As you can see, it's like 2016. I couldn't find any new data on this. I'm not sure who really compiles it. This was from Medscape a few years ago. But this shows like just raw number of prescriptions. So if we look at these drugs, they're all really old, not necessarily really old, but fairly old, small molecule generic medications that work. So just because we have all these new fancy drugs that we spend a lot of money on doesn't mean we don't prescribe the old cheap ones as well. So like levothyroxine has been around forever. It's elevates for people with low thyroid. It's a synthetic thyroid hormone, but you just have lots of prescriptions a year for these more generic, easy ones. Now you've got hydrocodone and acetaminophen, which is Norco or Vicodin or whatever you want to call it. That's probably not a good thing that's up on this list. But the point is that a lot of these medications are very cheap. So we do see a lot of cheap kind of generic prescriptions as well as the expensive stuff. This is information from Express Scripts in 2018. They're a pharmacy benefit manager, and it shows you how much money we generally spend per disease. So, like again, your inflammatory conditions, your Crohn's disease, your rheumatoid arthritis, it's a huge dollar bucket in healthcare right now, and it's because the best treatments out there are all biologic and they're all really expensive. Oncology is the same way. Usually the treatments are extremely expensive for even some of the oral medications available. Otherwise, you have some things that are a little bit just more common, like diabetes and blood pressure. Those are things that affect millions and millions of people worldwide. So you're going to see a lot of money just spent on that in sheer volume of prescriptions. But also in diabetes, for example, you've got insulin, which is relatively expensive. You also got a lot of newer therapies that have come out in the diabetes realm that are driving up some of the prices as well there. So how does a drug get to the market? Well, the goal of drug discovery is to find a molecule that's both safe and effective. So first of all, you want to look at preclinical. So that's usually animal testing. And then once the animal models look okay, you want to propose human trials and submit an investigational new drug application, or IND, to the FDA. If the FDA approves your IND, you can go into phase 1 research, which is a very small group of people. Usually you're looking at like less than 100 volunteers. And these are usually healthy people. I usually think of like the male college student as being the most apt, not to exclude females at all, but it seems to be more heavily male who tend to sign up for these types of things. But anyway, you have like a research institution like the University of Minnesota would have a trial going on, and they might put out kind of a notice for, men between the ages of 18 and whatever, or over 18 and not having any of these pre-existing conditions. Again, they want people who are healthy, don't have any confounding conditions going on, because that could skew their results a little bit. And the basic point of this is to look at two things. First of all, safety. You want to see if these people get any side effects. So that's great. If you're the first person to try a drug, you're like, all right, I'm just going to sit here and see if anything bad happens to me. That's kind of the point of it. So again, these people are usually paid a decent amount of money. I had a friend who did this in college, and we always kind of joked about it. But yeah, you do get paid for this. So it depends on how risk adverse you are. And then the other thing you're looking at is kinetics. So they want to see how the drug moves through the human body. So they're going to take blood samples. They might look at urine samples and things like that to see how the drug's metabolizing. And that'll give them a little bit of a frame of reference that should improve upon their animal models. For the animal models, they should have some decent studies. There's a lot of animals that metabolize drugs similar to how humans do. So if we have an idea for how long the drug lasts in a certain animal population, we should have a good idea for how long that's going to last in the human population. And then once we get that in healthy people, that gives us our benchmark going into a clinical trial. Now, where that gets confusing is if you are studying like a drug for diabetes in healthy people, but a lot of diabetic patients end up with renal dysfunction. So how do you dose adjust it if all your data came from animal models or healthy people? You kind of have to guess a little bit. So there's some tricky things to do here. But basically, at the end of this trial, if there's no unacceptable toxicity and your kinetics are looking good, you proceed to phase 2. If the kinetics are terrible, like if your healthy population is chewing through this drug and you have to dose it 5 or 6 times a day to get therapeutic concentrations, it's probably not going to go anywhere, because no one will take a drug 5 or 6 times a day, unless you're talking about something where there's absolutely no other treatment for. It's just not going to go. It's not going to fly for the general population. People just won't be compliant with it. There's no point in bringing it to market. Next step, phase 2. This is an emphasis on efficacy, and safety and short-term side effects are still being evaluated. So you're still going to look at those kinetic profiles. You're still going to look at what type of side effects people are having. But you also look at how does the drug work in people who have the specific disease or condition you're trying to treat. These are generally placebo-controlled, and usually they're small groups of people, but you're expanding it a little bit. So you might have a couple hundred subjects in this. And if you have evidence of efficacy shown, you're going to proceed to a larger phase 3 trial. Phase 3s are large-scale trials. They're usually the longest and biggest bulk of the whole drug approval process. So what you want to do in a phase 3 is confirm what you found in phase 1 and 2. You want to look at maybe different populations, trial a couple different doses, maybe look at different indications even. A lot of phase 3s need to go head-to-head against another drug. So for example, if you're trialing the newest and latest, greatest anticoagulant, you have to make sure it's equivalent to the standard of care. So we had a bunch of new anticoagulants come on the market in the past 10 years. And before that, we really had one oral anticoagulant, which was warfarin or Coumadin, which has a lot of issues with it. But it's a good drug. It works, but there's a lot of complications with it. We'll talk about that when we get to cardiology. But the point is that if anyone came to market with a new anticoagulant and said, hey, look, my placebo-controlled anticoagulant prevents stroke in AFib patients, like, well, yeah, so does warfarin. So how does it compare against warfarin? And so that's where you really need to have these head-to-head trials against the standard of care to make actually an impact. Otherwise, no one's going to take your trial seriously. Several hundred to, you might have 10,000 or more subjects. If you look at the trials that went on for the COVID vaccine, you have, way more than that, tons of people. So I always tell people who are like, oh, the COVID vaccine wasn't well studied. Well, actually, it was studied in more patients than the vast majority of pharmaceutical agents that come to the market. So that should give you some resolve if you got the vaccine. Then once you get done with your stage 3, you're going to submit your NDA or new drug application. The FDA has 60 days to decide whether or not it can be reviewed, and then they review it. They can fast track things based on if they feel like there's a need for that, or they can, kind of take their time with it, and it can take anywhere from like 6 to 10 months depending on how they prioritize that application. The technical phase 4 is also called a post-marketing data analysis, and this is for people to report, basically. There is some ongoing work the drug company will do to gather information, but for the most part, this is going to be self-reported. And what they're looking for is trends. Are they getting certain, certain number of responses specific to one adverse effect? And they might kind of do some more investigation. So a lot of times you do see things get like a black box warning or some sort of additional contraindication or precaution added to it after, because they just didn't see that during the clinical trials. Maybe it wasn't enough time, maybe they didn't have the right populations, and then once you have a new drug, maybe instead of hitting 10,000 people, you're hitting 100,000 or 1,000,000 people. That's just going to give you more of those kind of odd side effects that are going to crop up here and there that you might not have seen during that clinical trial just because you didn't have the numbers to see it. This is the FDA MedWatch program. So this is where anyone can go in and submit. So if you have a patient that's going on a new drug and they coming to you with kind of an interesting side effect that you don't have any other explanation for, you could always go fill out a MedWatch report or encourage them to do that. And I do encourage people to do this kind of stuff because it is a good way to keep our system accountable and to track these types of things. Okay, so what if the drug is not new? There's something called ANDA, or abbreviated new drug application. This is how generic medications are approved. And for generics, all the company has to do is be an established manufacturer, and they have to prove bioequivalence. So they have to prove that drug has basically the same kinetic properties. The reason is that when you make a generic product, you're using the exact same molecule in the drug. So the drug should really not be different. However, how it's packaged can be different. So if I'm buying a medication from Pfizer, the brand name product, the excipient ingredients, which are the things that aren't active, those are the inactive compounds in the product. So usually it's some kind of binder to keep the tablet together, whatever else is in it. That might be different. So that excipient might just have the drug deliver a little bit differently. Maybe it dissolves differently in the intestine or something like that. The generic manufacturer I don't think they can make it exactly the same, or they might not make it exactly the same depending on what they want to do. So what they end up doing is they put it into their pill the way that they usually make tablets, and it just might have enough bioavailable difference that it makes a difference, but usually it doesn't. Usually, as long as they know how to get drugs into the body, they're going to stick with what they do, and it'll be about the same. But you do get some variability between compounds, and sometimes that creates a little bit of a controversy. So if there's specifically a drug that you might be getting a slightly different absorption with a generic, and that could affect therapeutic levels and things like that. But it's really rare. Generally speaking, the vast majority of generics are accepted without question, and I highly recommend prescribing generics and not dispensing as written those brand names if you can avoid it, because basically you're just going to cost the patient more money in the long term. Over-the-counter medications usually start as prescription, and later they can move to OTC status. FDA applications are required for status changes. You'll see this over the course of your career. Most recently, I think the drugs I've seen go, it's been a while, but like a lot of the proton pump inhibitors like Prilosec, Nexium, those stomach acid GERD medications have all gone generic, or OTC, I should say, and generic too. And then you also have more recently the over-the-counter nasal sprays that are glucocorticoids like Flonase, and that's generic equivalents. Those are going generic over-the-counter now too. So we do see sometimes where things get put over the counter. Some things are just grandfathered in. They've always been over the counter, and even though they probably should be prescription, like aspirin might be better as a prescription medication because it can cause bleeding. But anyway, that's just always been over the counter and always will be. Vitamins, minerals, and natural products. The FDA, because of you can read on this if you want to. It's kind of interesting history, but there was a law passed several years ago. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but I talked more about this during supplements. I'll give you a little bit of history on that. But the point is that there was a law passed that basically restricted the FDA from having any authority over dietary supplements, vitamins, and things like that. Personally, I think that was a terrible decision, but that's the way we are right now, and the FDA has no regulatory authority. So the FDA basically has to, if somebody makes a bad batch of a supplement or is lying about their claims or is making something claiming it's a supplement that's really a drug, which happens, the stuff happens all the time, the FDA has to try to send them cease and desist letters, tell them to change their marketing. It's just a big kind of like chase your tail type mentality. And anyway, the point is that supplements are not regulated by the FDA. They aren't approved, and you don't technically know what you're getting with them. And we'll talk more about that in another lecture. All right. The average drug costs $4 billion to make. 1 in 10 drugs that reach, I think, phase 3 clinical trials will make it to market. So there's a lot of failures, and there's a lot of increase in failure rates too, and increasing costs. Costs don't go down over time. One thing to talk about too really quickly is the U.S. pricing bubble. One thing that comes up a lot, sort of an interesting separate discussion, but briefly, what you have with the United States and how we price drugs is we don't cap our we don't have a restriction on how much a drug company can charge. So a drug company can charge basically whatever they want to the U.S. population. There's no restriction on that. Most other companies, in fact, I think every other company in the world, country in the world has that specific cap in place. So they have some sort of restriction on how much a pharmaceutical company can charge. So what happens is pharmaceuticals tend to cost much less in other parts of the world compared to the U.S. because they can charge more in the U.S. because there's no restrictions from the government on that. That creates kind of a pricing bubble. Now, there's lots of talk about restricting that, at least with Medicare and Medicaid, so that they can buy drugs at a lower cost. But drug companies will argue to their death that that's going to stifle their R&D expenditures. Which, I think we could maybe all argue if they spent less money on direct-to-consumer advertising, they could maybe make up the difference. But that's something that is also unique in this country. I think New Zealand actually allows this too, which is odd. But that's, I think, the only other country in the world that allows direct-to-consumer advertising. So drug companies can advertise their products direct to consumer via commercials, which I think is just confusing. And I don't know exactly how beneficial it is. But the idea is, somebody goes into their provider, somebody comes to you in your future practice and says, I saw an ad for this, and it sounds like something that would really help me out. Can you prescribe it for me? And then you have to talk them off the edge there. But the point is that we do have that in this country, and the companies spend a lot of money advertising medications direct to consumer that way. There's some, not to get into too much in the weeds on it, but there's some interesting debate on that. I think there's some pros to it. You have maybe a more open health discussion. So if you see an ad for a certain disease, you'd be like, oh, wow, people, what is this disease and what do people take this drug for? And I've never even heard of this. So it does maybe have a consumer interest or education aspect to it. But most people just say it's a complete waste of money, and we should let healthcare providers direct those conversations. Probably the better answer. But anyway, I'll let you guys think about that as an ethical dilemma if you want to. This process, is it sustainable? It doesn't seem like it is with the failure rates, but drug companies seem to be doing okay. So we'll see. And just to show you guys that the vast majority of drugs in the world are produced in the U.S. So you have, again, if you're looking at that bubble mentality and the pricing and the research and development dollars and what the drug companies are putting back into their products, the U.S. is a really important part of the global supply of pharmaceutical agents and pharmaceutical R&D. Different drug research goals and things we might see in our future careers. Nothing really crazy right now, but genomics is something that gets talked about a lot. And it's more, the concept here is looking at somebody's genome and saying, well, your genome is set up this way, so that means that we can give you a specific drug tailored to your genetics that's going to work better. Or maybe if we look at your genetic profile, we can say, well, this drug in this class of medications, maybe in a certain class, there's 7 different agents, and we know that you metabolize drugs differently than the average person, so that certain drugs will work better for you. So we do look at some of that stuff. There is some of this going on with some medications, but for the most part, this is a little bit pie in the sky. I don't really want to talk about too much of this other stuff. Talk about biologics a little bit. Me Too pitfall is just a lot of drug companies will, like if a drug company comes out with a new drug that's promising, you'll see several other companies kind of make similar things. So you end up with not one drug, but you have 3 or 4 on the market that are all in the same class, and maybe have subtle variations to them, but are basically the same thing. That's what Me Too drugs are. I think it's good from a certain perspective because you get competition, but at the same time, if some drug company kind of misses the boat on it and comes out with their Me Too drug like 3 years later, it's like, well, we already have established care with all these other medications, so why would we switch to this new one unless there's something really good? So it's a risk that the companies are taking. Inactive, more active enantiomers. This happens a lot where there'll be a product on the market and the drug company will have a more active enantiomer in their back pocket. And when that drug gets close to its patent expiration, they'll kind of whip this drug out and say, hey, look what I've got. We've got this new one that's better. It's like, well, where was that all this time? We've just been sitting on it. So they end up with something that's very similar, but it's just different enough that works out. So you'll notice that when we talk about drugs, you'll see those drugs have like the same name, except one starts with ES. Yeah, it's the S enantiomer. Orphan drugs is a term you might hear from time to time. It's referred to as basically the term means medications designed for illnesses that are rare. And so there's just not a lot of money to be made when if you're making a drug and you want to make a lot of money, you want to target like blood pressure, diabetes, cholesterol. Those are bankable. If you're making a drug for HIV or MS or something like that, there's not a lot of patients out there, comparatively speaking, but those patients still need access to care, and you want to have development in that area. So that's where, again, there's kind of these conversations about drug companies charging a ton of money for certain things, and how ethical and sustainable is that? But they do probably pump a ton of money into the research there, so letting them recoup their costs. But the question is, what's reasonable for recouping versus kind of getting greedy? All right, now how does this affect you? Well, as a prescriber, you have to look at generic substitution. So know that states have laws that if you don't write something dispense as written, we will dispense the generic. So if you write a brand name on a prescription, you can do that, but it'll be dispensed as a generic if that's available. Insurance companies have formularies. Hospitals have formularies as well. So if you want to prescribe something specific, you might get it like in the hospital, if you want to order something for a patient, there's a ton of stuff I can just change about your order because we don't stock it, or we have an auto substitution policy that doesn't allow you to prescribe that particular medication. In the real world, non-hospital world, outpatient prescribing, pharmacists don't have that authority. So what they're going to do is they're going to come back to you and say, okay, well, you prescribed this. We have to call the insurance company. They said that the patient has to try this, and your office might have to submit paperwork on behalf of the patient saying that, yes, I want them on this new therapy because they failed XYZ therapies or something like that. They usually come back to you and say, nope, you can't prescribe this fancy brand name drug. You have to try something tried and true and old and generic because it's way cheaper, and you have to prove that patient needs the added cost. So that's something that happens quite a bit with your insurance companies, and that's the whole prior authorization component. Pharmacy pricing, I don't want to get into it too much, but there's various drug pricing programs out there, from $4 generics to manufacturer rebates and things like that. If your patient if they can't afford the drug, I always ask the pharmacist, see if they know of any rebate programs or anything like that. Drug shortages. Drugs kind of go in and out of shortage, some of them more than others. And what happens is that some company will just decide, you know what, I'm done making this. This isn't profitable for me, and we're done. And maybe they're the only company that made it. And then so anybody who's on it is kind of at a loss. But then another company says, well, hang on. If that company's not going to make it, I'm going to make it. And maybe I'll charge 10 times the amount, because I can legally do that in the United States. There's no restriction on that. And so then these people buy up these patents or whatever. They just come into the market and say, hey, look, I've got the drug, but you're going to pay 10 times the amount. And then the insurance companies and patients are left holding the bag there. So that happens quite a bit. Or you just end up running out of the drug, and then they switch to the alternatives. The alternatives go unshorted. It just creates this domino effect, and it's frustrating. So anyway, don't be surprised if somebody said, yeah, well, thanks for prescribing this, but we actually can't get it in right now. Here's an alternative that you could try. It happens more often than we like nowadays. Okay, talked about legal substitution, generic counterparts, again, excipients, everything we talked about. I don't think I really have much more to say. I will just give a disclaimer that I speak in brand and generic, and you should too. It's just the way the world works. I will be trying to do as much generic talk as possible, because that's the way we should all speak, as opposed to using trade names. And your exams will be in generic format with a couple odd exceptions. The vast majority of your exam drugs will be generic. So knowing the generics is the most important for this class. And also, I think for your board exams and things like that, you're going to have to just know generics. I don't think they give you trade names. So if you memorize all the trade names, great. You'll know what somebody is talking about in real life, but it might not help you on an exam. All right, why doesn't insurance cover this? So we talked about this a little bit too. They want to save money is the end of the day there. And then I kind of talked about pricing and reimbursement already. $4 generics. Remember that when you are buying a drug at a pharmacy, you're not only paying for the product, you're paying for the time it takes a pharmacist to review your profile, check for interactions, make sure the medication's safe, or make sure the medication's not expired, inspect the medication if it was filled by a technician. All those types of things are included in the cost. So yes, the drug itself might cost like 80 cents in wholesale price, but we charge $12 for it because it costs somebody money it costs time to process that. When it comes to drug pricing, I always keep this in the back of my mind. This was a professor of mine at the U who liked to quote himself in his lectures. So it's kind of like an inside joke for myself that I have a quote of his in my lecture. But he said that a drug that one cannot afford is neither safe nor effective. And it's always something that's kind of stuck out to me that, yeah, if the person can't pay for the medication, they aren't going to take it. So safety and efficacy doesn't matter at that point. So you always have to make sure you take pharmaceutical cost into consideration and be a good stewardship with your resources. One thing I do get occasionally is I get emails from people saying, oh, we had a guest speaker come in and they really talked about this medication being preferred over this. I'm like, yeah, but it's 10 times the cost. So you would only use it if you really had to. That's the point I'll try to drive home for some of these therapeutic discussions. Other random things to talk about quick. Controlled substances, you need to know them. They have a lot of regulations and things involved with prescribing them. And if you prescribe them inappropriately, you can be legally held responsible for that. I will kind of mention what's controlled and what's not controlled. You can probably guess the vast majority of controlled substances fall into, I think, 3 buckets. Opioid type pain medications. You have benzodiazepines, and you have like stimulants. There's a few others out there, but that's the bulk of them. So it's not too hard to remember them, but state to state will vary. But generally speaking, you can't give people refills for certain controls, and you only get 6 months. Minnesota has a prescription monitoring program. I believe Iowa does as well, but most states have something like this now. So wherever you go in the future, feel free to look into this. But what you can do is you can query a database just by typing name and date of birth, and it will give you a list of the controlled substances that person has filled. And usually you can cross-reference other states too. So like if I run it in Minnesota, I have the option to look at a couple of the other states in addition to Minnesota. Drug shortages, again, just to mention quickly, there is this website. ASHP is the American Society of Health System Pharmacy, and they have a shortage website there. Again, sometimes there's heavy implications if there's one manufacturer left standing. They can kind of gouge the market and make some money that way. Online pharmacies. There's a lot of reputable ones out there, and a lot of reputable companies offer online services. So not to get confused with the random pharmacy that you go to that says it's in Canada or whatever, and you buy medications without prescriptions. You don't really know what you're going to get. There's counterfeit drugs in the world, believe it or not, even for non-narcotic things, people sell counterfeits for. So it's just a matter of kind of rolling the dice. A lot of people will turn to this because they're self-medicating, or they can't afford the U.S. prices or whatever it might be. They go online and buy their meds that way. I highly discourage this because, again, you really don't know what you're getting. I actually had a professor in college who, in a former job, worked for Pfizer, and he worked in fraud, and he actually would analyze compounds from places that they would buy, different like online pharmacies or international sources or things like that. And he's like, you'd be surprised, a lot of the stuff didn't have any of the compound in it, or had stuff we didn't even know like would be totally unrelated compounds. So you really don't know what you're trying to do. And if you're trying to treat a patient and having them use unknown drug, you really don't, that's a variable that you can't control as a provider. So it's something that we highly discourage. Behind the counter is kind of like a weird status, and states vary in their laws on these. I'll put some little air quotes here for you guys because you guys really want these here. There, behind the counter. It's not like a real phrase. Well, it kind of is, but the idea is that you have to go through some sort of a hoop to get something, but you don't need an actual physician or PA or provider to sign off on it. So it could be pharmacist prescribed. Some states are allowing pharmacists to prescribe certain things. I think Oregon, for example, is allowing pharmacists to prescribe birth control now with some criteria. There's a lot of laws around the country looking at that kind of stuff. One example of behind the counter in Minnesota is pseudoephedrine, because it can be used to make methamphetamine. They put that behind the counter. So if you want to buy it, you're limited in how much you can buy, and you have to show your ID and things like that. So anyway, that's something that might come up occasionally. And finally, drug reference walkthrough. So drug references is another thing I get asked a lot about. What references do I like? And what references I use and like will probably be different than what you use. But there's a couple of really good ones that are kind of the standards in drug monographs as far as getting all the information. Micromedics is a great reference. It's maybe a little bit more detailed than most people want, but it has kind of two levels. There's sort of the basic stuff it gives you, and then you can go down into more detail if you want. It's very medication specific, whereas a resource like UpToDate is more general. So you can look at like a whole monograph of the disease, and then you can click through different things to read about the drugs and things like that. It's a little bit more Wikipedia-like, but it does reference a database called Lexicomp, which is quite good as well. It has a pretty comprehensive list of drug-related information in it. These are expensive to buy yourself, so most health systems provide these to their people, to their employees, I should say. If you don't, I think that I honestly would probably get one myself if I was going to be a practitioner or a provider in some capacity and I didn't have access to it. UpToDate, Micromedics, Lexicomp, they're all really worth it, I think. Sanford's really good if you do a lot of antibiotic prescribing. There's a Sanford guide, which is kind of like this little pocket guide, but it does have an online version now too. I used to see people using these pocket pharmacopoeias a lot, but I don't know if they really still exist anymore. Again, most stuff has moved to some sort of smartphone app at this point in our lives. And then Hippocrates is another one that's really popular because it's free. At least the basic version is. And Hippocrates is pretty good if you're just like looking for really simple information. You just want to know like, what is this drug, or what are the doses for this drug? Great. It's not going to have more detail that you would get out of Micromedics or Lexicomp UpToDate, but it's going to have the basics in it. So if you want to use it, great. There's a pay version of it that has quite a bit more information, and it is it's fine. I don't think it's as good as these two, but it is pretty decent. Natural Medicines Database is a good reference for anything herbal or supplemental. If you're wondering, like, what is this product this person's on? Maybe they come to you with a bunch of herbal products and you're like, I don't know what they're taking, or they interact with their medicine. Who knows? This is a good reference for that. There's an online resource that I use occasionally called Global RPH, and I'll use this. It's got a bunch of calculators on it, like if you want to calculate renal function. But again, a lot of apps, like Hippocrates, I think has a lot of calculators and stuff too. So there's a lot of ways to get that information. Guidelines are great. At the end of the day, going directly to the guideline is probably the best practice. So if you want to go to the summary and just kind of read what's up to date in the guidelines, that's always good to do. Always be familiar with existing guidelines in your practice areas, because you're going to want to know what the most up-to-date literature is saying to do. You don't have to follow the guideline. It's not a rule, but it is a recommendation. Most people will tend to follow those specifically. Lit searches, you guys don't need me to talk about that, but yeah, I have found myself in weird situations where I'm actually doing PubMed lit searches, trying to look at like case reports of an adverse effect, or case reports of using a medication for a specific thing. So every once in a while I do end up kind of diving into the literature that way to answer a provider's question. All right, so that's what I've got for the first lecture. The other lecture that's posted and recorded is your pharmacokinetics lecture. That's a really, really important foundational lecture. It has all the information about how medications are metabolized, and so I strongly suggest you take some time with that and understand it. We're going to talk a lot about things like renal function, liver enzymes, and how those work to metabolize drugs and their role in drug-drug interactions. So it's going to come back a lot throughout the course. So again, I really highly recommend you spend some time on that lecture. There's also a lot of foundational kind of basic pharmacology about receptors and interactions and things like that that we aren't going to spend a lot of time on throughout the rest of the course. So having that background is really important, and that will be testable material. So I recommend, again, spending a good amount of time on that and reviewing it as you need to. But that's it for this one, and we'll go into antibiotics starting next week. And we've got a couple weeks to cover that and some miscellaneous ID. So that's that. If you have questions, again, feel free to email me and I'll be available.